afternoon at your first and definitely not your last lunch and learn. A couple of things I want to raise before we get started. If you right now, or if you know someone, you directly, or if you know someone that is currently experiencing any type of domestic violence or child abuse, I strongly encourage you to reach out to John or me directly. This is being recorded, and then there's also the chat, but I want to honor your confidentiality. And so if you know someone, or if you yourself is needing help, I encourage you to reach out directly. And I'll share my contact information at the end of this presentation. And before we get started, I also want to share that I definitely, without a doubt, am here because of faith, and because this is a calling and a purpose that I've been called to do. And so I do that, first and foremost. I always say that because it was just a couple of years ago, after 26 years of running many programs and helping many nonprofits and leading California to expand the rights for crime victims. The pandemic kicked in, and I thought, well, maybe it's time to stop. I shared with John and some of the administrators just a few minutes ago that the symbol behind me, the Beloved Survivors Trauma Recovery Center symbol, is symbolic because it is one of the victims of the 4 that were murdered within the first few months that the pandemic started in 2020. So by July, this was the 4th victim. There's a purple heart in the center, and then the 4 little ducks off to the side. She left behind 4 children trying to escape her abuser. And I'll elevate significant information around prevention as we go through this presentation. I also want to acknowledge that I know that 1 in 3 are a victim of domestic violence, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men. And so I understand that this information can be emotionally intense. And so I welcome you after the presentation. If you want to reach out and just process or share anything that may have come up for you, I'll make that time available to you. As we move forward, I want to just share a little bit about myself. I am a survivor. My mother was a victim of domestic violence, and I'm the oldest child in the sibling order. So a lot of the responsibility with parenting and with calling, 911 for help, that fell on me. And so when you think about some of the largest studies that have come up with ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, my experience resonates with all of that, in that I had many of those scores long before the studies became published and relevant. And so doing the work here in the Central Valley is always near and dear to my heart. I do spend a lot of time just all over statewide, but I'm always close to home because this is where my heart and my calling is. And so I shared a little bit about you with you about the symbol of Beloved Survivors Trauma Recovery Center at the logo and where it comes from and why. And as John has mentioned, I'm a clinician here in the Central Valley, and founded the nonprofit after I had a conversation with God and just shared, with you all that when the pandemic hit, by that time I had already responded to many things. I was part of the group that went to Nevada, Las Vegas in 2017. So that mass shooting, most of the attendees at the concert were from California. And so I led one of the groups there to do the crisis response. After that, and so many other responses that I had done around mass violence and just violence in general, I really thought there's probably nothing more that I could experience, but the pandemic really shifted that. What happened in 2020 was it became very normal, very fast, to be making funeral arrangements, which was much different than what I had done within that first 25 years of my career. And it started to become very normal. A lot of it was because we didn't have a blueprint. We didn't have services that were specific to operating during everything that came with this pandemic. And so I didn't want to become in a position where death became normal, and violence, was just something that was looked at from a lens of intervention. At the same time, I'm a mother and a wife, and it started to take its toll on me. And between the last domestic violence victim that was murdered, and within 24 hours, there was a toddler that was also unfortunately murdered. And I took myself out for a while to really process and just come face to face with God and say, you know, what is it that you want me to do? Should I hang it up here and wrap it up? You know, show me some signs. Is there anything, you know, that I'm missing? And I received a call within a few months from a couple of elected officials, and they were looking to specifically strengthen rights and laws to protect victims, not just in California, but really nationwide. We knew we hit a place where we needed to do something, and that something did not have a map to it at the time. And so that's how I gradually came back in. And you know, what needed to be done hadn't been created yet. And so I created the first trauma recovery center because at the time I was getting a lot of requests for assistance with victims that had either been impacted by COVID and were homeless, you know, didn't have access to housing, and also did not have the resources to hire attorneys or get the legal help that they needed to help them move through the process and safeguard their protection. And you know, we were dealing with mass grief at the time, so there was so much going on that many stories were being lost. And so the need to really do the intervention, the prevention, and the aftercare was the clarity that I got at the time. That was the message that I took, and has been the center of where the Trauma Recovery Center focuses on. And so we operate from a lens of really focusing on equity from a multidimensional lens. And when I say that, what I mean by that is this, is that when I say, you know, diversity and equity and culturally inclusive, I mean that from, you know, a very intentional, specific, targeted lens. And that looking at things such as how many rights victims have, how they're able to get access to that information, looking at the resources and how they're distributed throughout the Central Valley, and underserved communities, and making sure that, you know, we don't lose sight of their needs. So that's when I say multidimensional, I'm talking about a very concentrated effort specifically to uplift those, you know, those gaps in services, those populations that need more voices. And many times, you know, I'll get messages and emails and different people that reach out that'll say, you know, we've done a ton of work, you know, to look at, you know, racial equity and racial justice, and that is significant and important. And what I'll also say to that is that I'm also very specific in how I look at that. I don't believe that we'll achieve equity in just my generation alone. And myself and the staff, we don't look at it from a checklist approach, meaning that, you know, the culture of violence, the culture of prevention, it's going to be lifelong and it's going to be generational. And so we've made that commitment. And so when the type of work that we do, we approach it from that lens. And so, you know, one of the biggest discussions I have right now statewide is, you know, now there's been a ton of money issued out for housing and, you know, for some victims' rights. However, you know, for example, the undocumented community, it'll take 20 years for their U visas to get processed if they filed this year because of the backlog. And, you know, those are the kind of approaches that we take to uplifting equity. You know, same thing with, for example, with Black victims. We live in a country that has, you know, a very difficult time acknowledging that, you know, specifically Black men and women can be victims. And so some of the work that I do around that is specifically uplifting that, how far we are behind on that. You know, God connected me with Curtis's mom, Curtis Williamson. That's Patricia's son, who was murdered 25 years ago. It took 20 years to get his death labeled a homicide. And it took 4 death certificates to get it correctly, you know, determined to be a homicide, which in California, unless it's labeled that way, you're not granted access to services. So those are the kind of leaps that we're having to make, and the, you know, shifting the culture of violence. That's the approach that we take from a very broad, multi-dimensional lens. Specific right now in my work is domestic violence. And for those of you that have not had any educational information, I'll explain it in a very summarized, due to time limitations, method that I can. Domestic violence is a cycle of abuse patterns that operates from many factors that are abusive. It can be physical, it can be verbal, emotional, sexual, financial, especially now because of the, you know, the whole virtual dependency right now. There's a lot of virtual threats going on with victims, and, you know, social media bashing and things like that. So it can take on many forms, but it's very difficult to leave and end an abusive relationship because it's also combined with a lot of love and moments of the honeymoon stage, where victims oftentimes are promised, you know, I'll never do it again, I'm sorry. A lot of abusers have been clinically diagnosed with personality disorders. And so to the public, they can look very much like very generous individuals. They can do no harm. So victims oftentimes struggle with, will I be believed? Or will I be questioned? Or will I be blamed? And then it repeats right back into that cycle. But with it becomes a very difficult life of being isolated from loved ones and being stripped of any independence, the ability to work, to have a bank account, to have access to anything external is monitored. And so it becomes very challenging. And when you're withdrawn and when you're codependent on an individual that threatens with violence, it can be very difficult and deadly to get out of that type of relationship. And so that is the most simplest way I can explain domestic violence in short time that we have together. Specific to Fresno, what I want you all here to really center and focus in on is this right here. I oftentimes get pulled into, you know, Stockton, San Diego, Sacramento, and sometimes in the East Coast and other states. But part of the reason why, you know, Fresno is specifically in the Central Valley area is an area that I always gravitate towards, because, you know, this work is very demanding. And I believe that I have a responsibility to continue to advocate geographically specific to this area. You know, I will not bore you with stats, but I felt it important and very informative to give you this information. Every 9 seconds in the United States, a woman is usually the victim of domestic violence, far more than men. Fresno police in 2020, Fresno police reported on, you know, 30 domestic violence calls per day. 9,000 calls total for the year of 2020. And before that, it was 8,000. Fresno is number 1. California calls to 911 for domestic violence. Oakland is second. So I want to pause right there, because I'm not just, you know, going to read numbers to you. And let's really take that in. Fresno is number 1 in California calls to domestic violence. And as I say that to you, you know, I always get chills when I read that, because, you know, my personal story, I was one of the siblings that made that call. And you're a student population. And what I want you to take from that is that it's very important for you to know that information, because as you go on into your careers, I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that without a doubt, you will encounter somebody, if you have not already, that is struggling with domestic violence. And so you know that the demand is very, very overwhelming, and our resources are very limited. And when John reached out to me about presenting on domestic violence, I knew immediately that I needed to elevate what's gone on since the pandemic and surviving during this pandemic. Because so often many of us are miseducated that we can make a report either to law enforcement or to CPS, and then we assume that we did something, we took an action, and then we stop there. And that's not accurate, especially right now. Law enforcement and all of our, governed stakeholders, they are overwhelmed and our resources are very limited. So really important to think about this so that we don't jump to the conclusions and do any victim blaming, or, fall short when there's an opportunity to connect someone that's struggling with anger issues to access help when they need it. Before the pandemic, studies reported 60% of children were in these abusive homes. Unfortunately, and my heart breaks that because of the pandemic, they were all witness to the violence that occurred. And so, that is something that I uplift in prayer every day. And, and really to also pray for the teachers that have now had to come back into the classroom with our children in Fresno Unified District that struggles with poverty and everything else that comes with it. And then have to have our children in their classroom with everything that they've been exposed to during this time. So what changed there specifically that impacted domestic violence? I want to be very clear that, in educating people that COVID did not cause domestic violence. COVID magnified it. It magnified it because of the stay-at-home orders, created more and direct access to children being exposed, which will affect their performance in the classroom. And I was looking up, your university, and you all do a lot for education and preparing teachers. And, that's something that I want to elevate here. Very important for them to know this information because a lot of times our teachers are the very first person that a child will confide in that something is wrong at home. So very important to mention that here. And then during the pandemic, shelters were at capacity. I love Marjorie Mason Center. They're always near and dear to my heart. My senior year of high school, we were there. My mother and I were there. And so, they provided a safe space for us and my siblings. And, they're always, the primary resource in the Valley for emergency shelter. However, they've been needing to grow for some time, especially their beds. And so when this pandemic hit, they were at capacity. That was one thing. The other thing was their human too, and their staff was also exposed to COVID, like many shelters throughout our nation. And so the staff to victim need ratio was also impacted. So all that is important to know when we're in a position where we have family members and loved ones and colleagues that are struggling with domestic violence and the threats, most importantly, and violence elevated. And speaking to not just the Marjorie Mason Center, but Women's Haven Center in Modesto and all of the other battered women and battered intervention shelters that provide emergency housing. This is something that we talked about was because of that increased threat and violence. What also went up was the homicide rate. And so our next population, when we think of just child abuse, our next population is going to be a lot of children that our teachers had to interact with that present with unresolved grief. Hands down, guarantee it. I do a lot of presentations all over the state to a lot of the campuses. Specifically, my heart is with the elementary, junior high, because they need it. And it never fails that, after a presentation, I get the teachers that stay with me. They'll start shedding tears and sharing with me very difficult positions that they've been put in and didn't have just a safe outlet to process what they were exposed to. Something important for us to keep in mind. What I want to do is really work with you to develop a framework of how you look at intervention and prevention. So intervention is services received during and after experiencing abuse. So that is how our state defines intervention. So examples would include accessing emergency shelter, restraining orders, court accompaniment, all of those type of services, and many others. Prevention has two specific factors in it. One is before experiencing domestic violence, and that is what we would call primary prevention. There's been no exposure to domestic violence. However, there's been no education of a healthy relationship. And so that's where we focus our information and education on, is teaching our loved ones and our community at large what a healthy relationship is. And then so often I get, well, that's different. It is, because it's proactive, it's not reactive. And so we're not responsive. We're delivering information on what it means to be affectionate, what it means to express healthy love, and, you know, working around how to adopt that within families is one of the services that I really appreciate doing. And then the other part of prevention here is secondary prevention. And what that is the abuse has already been experienced. Children have already been exposed. However, there's the need to prevent it from further harm. And there's where we put individuals in together with prevention interventionists and prevention experts to work on that. And so often we'll have a lot of victims that will share, you know, like, this is all I knew. I didn't know that, you know, being called names was verbal abuse, and being told, you know, I'm ugly, fat, no one's ever going to want me, was harmful. You know, that's how my mother was treated. And, you know, they're still married. So my definition of a successful relationship was they never divorced. And so we work with a lot of, you know, dismantling miseducation and uplifting what is healthy. And then we also provide victims with very important information on safety planning here. I want to make sure that I dive into this and then give time for you all to ask me any questions, because this is the most important piece that you can take from our presentation here. Number one is notification of release. When I shared with you just a few slides ago that we cannot assume that, you know, making a report or simply telling our loved one, you know, hey, here's a hotline number, or, you know, let's call 911 together, that's going to put an end to the abuse. It's also important to know what information to have when somebody is arrested. So right now, because of the onset of COVID and how it's impacted institutions, jails, and prisons, very important for survivors, for victims to know that you have the right to be notified when someone's being released that's incarcerated. And there's two links that I have for you here. The Vine link is this first one right here. And you go to that and you can put your information so that you can become informed when an individual that's incarcerated is being released. If it's a prison institution, it's going to be with CDCR, and that's the second link here. And it's a form 1707 that you'll have to complete. And that also informs you of any change in custody. So if somebody's transported to a different institution, I cannot reiterate enough to you how important it is to know that information. You know, counties such as Madera County that I do, you know, still work a lot in, sometimes there's one Walmart there. And it is extremely alarming for somebody to be in a store and all of a sudden run smack into somebody that they helped put in jail. That fear is very startling and extremely traumatizing. And it robs individuals of an opportunity to put some safety parameters in place. So how does this help victims? I'll tell you what it helps them do. A couple of things. If they know that somebody's getting released, they can take a double look at, if they have a restraining order, they can take a look at it and make sure they know when it expires. They can also be in communication with probation and parole about their safety concerns. If they want to relocate, this gives them, that notification and how to make that move in a timely manner. Things such as filing proper, child custody orders. It's that timely piece of being notified that gives them the opportunity to make those decisions and take those actions. That is why this is very important. Very important for us to know that the most dangerous time for a victim is when she or he ends a relationship. And we saw that. That is what we were witness to during this pandemic, because victims were there were stay-at-home orders and they were self-isolating and had limited access to public areas that would, before the pandemic, they would have public access to. And so because of that, we saw a startling number of homicides go up with victims that tried to escape and didn't make it. And so it brought us back to this place that we know the most dangerous time for a victim is when you're going to end that relationship, because we have to think of what drives the person committing the harm, and that's power and control. So when they believe I've lost power and I'm losing control, you guarantee the threat of death just shot up. Two things that I emphasize that are not talked about enough are this right here. I've also worked and continue to work now with individuals that are incarcerated. They teach me a lot. And what they've taught me is that, there are those that have the belief, usually it's her, but it can also be him. If I can't have her, no one will. If I cannot have her, no one will. And so they were willing to elevate that threat to a point of death. And so nothing was going to stop them. None of our prevention education, none of that was going to work. They were willing to take that effort. The reason why I emphasize that is because what I say is not, elevated enough. This is why there's a correlation between officer killings and domestic violence, because of what I just repeated to you. If I can't have her, no one will. Anybody right now after this presentation can Google, officer killed while responding to domestic violence, and I guarantee you, you'll have a list of links to click on because of that belief right there. So knowing that, as we go on with safety planning here, some very important things to know when victims are leaving a relationship, especially right now. People have become more tech savvy. Virtual and digital methods of communication have put people that traditionally maybe wouldn't use a lot of electronic devices in a position where they had to learn. With that, it's important to know that you can be tracked on these devices. So one of you or anybody says, hey, you can come and stay with me till things cool down. Please know that devices have GPS systems, and you need to know what method of tracking is there so that you can disable those devices, or at least turn off the tracking apps on them. Know about child custody laws. It's so easy for people to misinform somebody that, you could just leave and take your children with you. Restraining orders, oftentimes, in restraining orders, you can list child custody in there for children that need to be protected in an abusive relationship. Also important to note, to be in communication with your domestic violence provider, your shelter in your county. For Fresno, that's Marjorie Mason Center, because they have the access to, the legal advocacy piece if somebody cannot afford it, to be able to guide them and inform them on their options for safeguarding children and preventing them from being used as a weapon in domestic violence relationships. Victims can register for, Safe at Home, which is another link here that I provided to you. So making sure that the address is confidential. Again, so anybody that's trying to stalk and track, you reduce that likelihood by having your address registered confidential. Collecting important documents. A lot of times when it's a threat of life or death, and these victims know firsthand what it's like to be in that moment and feel like I'm not going to make it out alive. So planning that exit is very helpful, because when you go to access certain legal documents or request assistance, try to get a place, try to get social service assistance, you'll need things such as birth certificates for school, for shot records, medical records. All of that information is very much needed. So when you plan to exit a relationship, getting those documents. And right now, because of our virtual communication and dependency, also passwords, you want to get those and make sure you change them immediately when you leave. All of that is very important to know. One of the things I always recommend is that survivors that leave these relationships have a support system that they trust and that they're constantly in communication with. Develop a code that lets them know when you're safe. It can be anything such as, purple bear means I'm safe. Red flag means I'm not safe right now. I came to this location to pick up our son's inhaler, and unfortunately, somehow he knew I'd eventually come here, and he's here. So that means, for 911 to be called. Developing those important steps, it can be life-saving. And so I strongly encourage that. Pay attention that right now, access to certain services has changed. And so participating in things virtually has become more of a practice. Communicate whenever there's a challenge there. So when we talk about equity, for example, we work with a lot of families that are in very, poverty impacted neighborhoods of Fresno. And so they either rent a room, or they work in fields or in areas where confidentiality is absolutely impossible. So working with different providers to understand that they can't afford internet that protects their information, and they can't afford to risk their confidentiality by attending a virtual court session. So can you please make this in person for the individual, and working with our neighboring community partners to set things up in a safe way so that they can access their services. What I hate to see happen is somebody get accused of not attending, court, or, getting dismissed as not a priority for child mediation for custody orders, when all it was they didn't have access. So really important to understand that. This slide right here is what really drives me to this work right now. One of the things that I'll share with you is that I cannot tell you how heartbreaking it is to get calls, emails, messages, people that approach me and my staff and will share with us. I knew my son, my brother, sometimes it's a woman, had a problem, but God knows I didn't think they would go this far. I get that so often, to the degree where I can share with you that if there is anything I can do to reduce the likelihood of having to help families make funeral arrangements, I will do just that. And that's this slide right here. Another piece of education that's not put out, that I wish it was put out more, is telling people, do not help stalk or locate a victim that's in safety or trying to seek safety. So often I'll hear, somebody's getting subpoenaed, and they'll reach out to us and, look, I got a subpoena, but God knows I didn't think they were going to do this. I did, go onto the person's Facebook, or I looked up their IG account and I realized certain things, and I took a screenshot, and I'm like, what I can do is pray for everybody. What I won't do is try to interrupt that process of accountability. Reporting any knowledge of intent to harm. You know, staying silent is easy. Speaking up is uncomfortable. It can also be life-saving. So many people after the last victim of domestic violence that I helped had said just that, how they are living right now with much survivor's guilt. For the clinicians, social workers on this call, that is something that you will encounter a lot of in this next generation. One of the aftermath effects of grief is that survivor's guilt from people that have had to attend funerals and have had to interact with loved ones that are left behind. And the repeated trauma of flashbacks of, you know, I go back to that same time where the person approached me and I regret not taking action. So I feel that it's important for me to use these opportunities, share that information with you all, to report anybody that is trying to harm and find someone that's in safety. The best thing you can do for them and for that victim is to report it and elevate that information to law enforcement. Do not loan vehicles or weapons to somebody that's looking to harm a victim. That is exactly what happened with this very case that, you know, we dedicated our logo to. And discourage somebody that's trying to harm and locate somebody and stalk a victim. Discourage them, let them know. That is very harmful. What you're doing, it can cause a lifetime and generations of pain and hurt. And encourage them to seek help is something, an action that you can take to possibly save a life. Third-party support, what I want to share here is don't become an interventionist. You can put your own life in harm's way. So somebody calling you saying, you know, I'm in harm's way right now, please don't rush over there. If law enforcement is, if there's a correlation between domestic violence calls and officers being killed, believe me, you are no different and are in the same, you know, can be viewed at and this from the same threat level of threat there. Develop a lens of violence prevention and, you know, and report that and also work with those individuals to access help. It helps to not look at it from a lens of, you know, I just want you to end this relationship. That person that's struggling with that behavior is just going to go on to the next victim. That's what will come out of that. So really telling that person, please, you know, get the intervention and the help beyond what court-ordered help looks like. If you notice somebody that's in extreme isolation and you have suspicion, please, you know, reach out and pick up the phone, you know, and try to make that contact, but not physically putting yourself in the middle of that. There are pros and cons of reporting, and it's important to know that as well. Oftentimes I get teachers and law enforcement reach out to me and will say, you know, I had a feeling that if I responded this time or if I made that report, that student wouldn't be in my classroom again. That victim would be in further isolation. And oftentimes it's true. I won't sugarcoat anything. So knowing that is part of the reason why I mentioned the need for more access to resources and connecting individuals, whether they're the victim or the abuser, encouraging them to getting the help they need to get that assistance. And so not staying, you know, silent is the reason and my motivation. This picture right here is the last domestic violence victim and several individuals. These are her 3 of her 4 surviving children that she left behind while trying to escape. And several people, you know, reached out saying, I knew, and God, I wish I would have did something differently. And yes, there was a vehicle. Now that the prosecution has taken place and there's been a sentencing, I can share with you publicly now that somebody regretfully loaned a vehicle and a weapon. And that is the reason why I share that information with you here. I do want to leave a little bit of space here for questions from you all at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez, for that amazing presentation. There were some comments in the chat. I mean, I'm personally, and I'm sure other people are very impacted by what you shared. Thank you for sharing your personal story along with just your advocacy work. It definitely is a calling, and thank you for that. It's a form of ministry, so thank you for the work that you do. We did get some comments. People were learning. I learned a lot. So people were learning a lot of new things. There were 2 questions that came into the chat. One is, are you comfortable sharing the PowerPoint presentation afterwards with the guests?
Yeah, I'm happy to share I want you to have it. I'm not one of those gatekeepers of information and help.
Okay,
You
great.
most definitely are welcome to have that information.
Thank you. And we'll send it out to the attendees. Second, there was a question, and I don't know, Professor Medina, did you want to ask your question? Let's see if she's still here.
Yes, sorry, my computer is going off here, but yeah, I just thank you for that presentation, Tina. That was amazing, and you gave some really valuable information. I think new information surrounding how the impact of the pandemic, has had so far, and just kind of the after effects of that. But my question lied around the discussions about how to promote safety or support those, just kind of creating safety networks and such. And I had heard through some others that have worked in the field that this is something that was new to me that I found out. And maybe you or the person that trained the people that I talked to, but talked about how people can actually, there's apps out there that people can kind of secretly put or hide on other people's phones, so that they can kind of not only track them, but be able to listen to their conversations, have access to their phone to send messages, just kind of like highlighting some of that gaslighting that can take place in, abusive relationships. So I wanted to know if you were aware of that, or if you had, resources on how to actually, maybe educate the public about that, because I think that was something that was new for me, and I just found that out about a year ago.
Yes, so absolutely. The digital technology, very savvy individuals have come up with very strategic ways to stalk and track individuals. And so you're absolutely right. There is apps that can be hidden on people's vehicles. I've seen it I've responded to where it was on their vehicles, and also, apps installed on tablets, telephone devices that nobody knew about. So, whenever we help house somebody, we oftentimes have their devices left at a public location at our administration office is public, but none of the, where we actually house and place victims is not public. And so before they get there, we, scan for all of that, and we make sure those devices are left at the public location and not taken into safety, to reduce that level of risk there. And so the other thing too that we caught on to recently, and I thank you for your question, is that one thing that we learned is that even knowing that amongst ourselves, but also people with Ring cameras that see somebody and then they report it back. And I caught that. It was brought to my attention last year. Our gang violence is very prevalent here in the Valley, and so this victim was being threatened by the person was in custody that harmed her, but was sending his some of the gang members out to monitor her, and one of them had a Ring camera, and so they were reporting through the Ring camera. I saw her pass by here and there. So this digital age has caused us to be more vigilant around technology. And so there are some organizations that I'm aware of that specifically have information on that, and I'll email that to you so that you can share it with your student population as well. Very important, to have that, and also to be familiar with how to protect oneself from that type of stalking.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, if we can make that source available, that'd be wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.